Welcome everybody. Quickly introducing myself, I'm Arjan, I work in marketing, and I'm delighted today that we have Lord Browne here. And I had the honor, probably in May this year, to meet in person in London, just before your book was released. And I read the book actually, and I really recommend everybody, if you haven't done so, to read the book, because it is really the kind of LGBT lean in. You might not like that analogy, but I thought it was really well researched.
Cheryl may not like
Cheryl
it
might not like it.
But
it was really well researched. There was really a lot of things were in there that you said, I didn't know that, and I really enjoyed it. And Lord Browne, of course, can introduce himself. I will say a couple of things. You know, he was 13 years, I think, CEO of BP. I don't have to explain BP to anybody of you. I think the share price quintupled, if that's English. I think that's English. So that's pretty amazing. And so that all sounds really all very nice and great. But I think at the end of your tenure, suddenly, you know, you were very publicly outed, you know, as a gay man by the wonderful UK papers. I don't know if there's anybody here from the UK, but you know, if you want to get depressed, you know, it's a guilty pleasure I do when you're in the British Airways lounge, you read the Daily Mail. I don't know if you've ever read the Daily Mail, but you really don't want to live. You know, it's kind of really, it's quite sharp and quite negative.
I think it's tamed itself a bit compared with the past.
Yeah, probably. And so the idea is really that, you know, we start off maybe with a couple of questions that I prepared, but the whole idea is, you know, it's a Google talk that anybody of you can really ask him a question. Also, he has done already 2 talks in Google, one in London and one in New York. So clearly, you know, Lord Browne will have an opinion on what Google is, you know, and we sometimes think that we're that terrific. I sometimes think that, you know, so are we really that terrific? What could we do better? Are we great at LGBT inclusion? What about diversity? And I'm sure you have a lot of ideas around it. But maybe kick off with the very easy question. So why did you write the book?
Well, good afternoon. I wrote the book for a few very simple reasons. The first is, and today's a very important day, I just was looking at the list of people who were running significant corporations around the world, and I took the S&P list, and I had to go down to S&P number 723, I think it was at the time, before I found an out gay CEO. And I thought that's statistically unusual. You know, why is there only one person in the top, let's say, 750 companies who's out and gay? That got changed today when Tim Cook came out. So there are now 2, which is great, but one very significant one. We'll come back to that. Secondly, I thought to myself, I really didn't want anyone to go through the same experience as I did. Thirdly, I thought that, and I knew that in my own experience, you can talk to people about what to do, how to think about themselves, but the best way of demonstrating it is to find role models that people can identify with and find a little piece of themselves in it to give them confidence to be themselves, to come out, to behave in an authentic way in business. And finally, I wrote this book to send a great big letter to the straight people of the world and said, you know, it's time that we redoubled efforts to make inclusion of LGBT people a big priority. And I gave them some tips on how they do it. And I really focused it on the leadership of corporations. The book's about corporations because I'm not a football player, I'm not an artist, you know, I'm not in different walks of life with different problems and issues. I'm a business person, so I talk about business.
Yeah. And as a CEO of BP, you were there 13 years, you clearly had made it. You know, the company was doing incredibly well. There was, how much more was there to gain for you? So why didn't you come out?
Well, because I was used to being in the closet. I mean, it's an amazingly trivial answer to a complex question. You have to go back to my history. And some of it is now irrelevant, but the outcome may be very relevant. So I built myself 2 lives. And the reason I did that is that when I could understand my sexuality, it was actually illegal to do any homosexual act in the UK and in most of the states of the United States of America. So it was a dangerous position to be in. You could be blackmailed, you could be threatened, you could be bullied. So I said, I think I'll keep that to myself. And secondly, I came from a family with my mother who was a survivor of the Holocaust, survivor of Auschwitz, and her couple of tips for life, very strongly held, were, first, if you've got a secret, don't tell anybody, because it's no longer a secret if you tell one person. And secondly, just be careful about being a member of a minority, because minorities are always punished when the going gets tough for the majority. And actually, in her experience, that's exactly what she identified. So for me, it was a pretty convincing case that I had to keep two lives separate. It was, when I was doing this in my 20s, it felt exciting and interesting. It's like being James Bond. You know, you have a legend and you have reality, and you must never let them meet. And so I built this huge edifice of two lives, and I got used to it. And I believed that as I was getting more senior, actually, as I was in business, I thought that if people knew I was gay, I'd lose supplier respect, I'd lose customers, I wouldn't be able to deal with foreign governments, and my peers would make fun of me, and they'd think I'm weak. So I kept it to myself. And strangely, you know, because there were no role models around, I didn't notice the world changing, and I just kept those fears in my head to the very end. Yeah. And that's why I was outed by a former boyfriend. Much more complex story, but I was outed in the Daily Mail group, newspapers, on the 1st of May 2007.
Yeah. And before we go into that, trust me, I have a couple of difficult questions, but we're doing the softballs now. Okay. So
this is a warm-up.
This is a warm-up.
I like that.
You know, if I look at myself, not to talk about myself, but everybody likes talking about themselves. I came out late, you know. What happened is that probably in my 20s, I was extremely focused on work because I didn't go through the kind of normal relationships, ups and downs, the kind of focusing on your personal life. So it meant actually that I progressed my career for my age incredibly fast. So would you have been CEO of BP if you... It's a catch-22.
It's a hypothetical question.
I know.
Because you never know. Because what you take away, you get on another basis. Yeah. So I was very focused on my work. I was probably obsessively focused on my work throughout my entire career. Yeah. That's also true. And I didn't have these relationships, but I had a lot of interference from trying to get relationships in a half-baked way. Yeah. You know, because you can't actually have a relationship if you're only half a person. It's rather difficult to make that work. Yeah. And I think in work, what I became, a friend of mine in the city here, San Francisco, said to me, she's a lesbian, a bisexual woman. She said, well, I always knew there was something wrong with you because even as an Englishman, you redefined the word reserved. And that was my protection. Yeah. You know, I just didn't engage on any personal matter with people at work. And as a result, I was regarded with, while I think I was, you know, people followed me, I think they followed me with a high degree of concern that no one could see behind the veil. You know, there was a lot going on which no one could see, and I didn't let them see.
Yeah. So that's very interesting. And now getting to the more difficult ones. So you're a very smart businessman. You've been very successful. You're very good at assessing risks. So you start a relationship with a 24-year-old escort. That sounds like risky to me.
So here's the thing. I mean, I think you know, certainly conducting a life like mine, I think it's taught me how to read people very quickly and how to be dynamically positioned and how to understand people quite well. But here's the logic. This is the mad logic. So I got to a very senior position in BP, and I know it's the oil business, but I was very visible and I was very recognizable. Wherever I went, people would recognize who I was, because at the time BP, I think, was the third largest company in the world. So I decided that logically, therefore, I couldn't go out to meet somebody, but I wanted to have somebody. So the answer was the safety of an escort website, which I thought was obviously very safe because I didn't have to tell anyone about it. So that was judgment error number one. Number two error, because all errors come in threes, was to meet someone and actually believe that a person I met in that way I could build a sort of relationship with, and which I couldn't. And the third error of judgment was to have a cover story about how I met him, and to believe that I could maintain that story even as I was going to court to prevent this story being published. So I actually I lied in a witness statement, which I corrected very quickly because I couldn't believe I'd done it. So someone, probably my inner self slapped me in the face and said, "Stop it." So 3 errors of judgment in a row.
I think there's a fourth one, if you don't mind.
No, please.
So, which is you hired a top law firm. So shouldn't you have hired a top PR firm?
Oh, I did both.
Oh, you did both. Okay. It's not in your book. You say.
So, no. Well, so I hired a top law firm to. In 2006, it was all the rage to have all the rage. It was fashionable, I think, for a lot of people to have these so-called super injunctions in the UK, which you could stop people publishing things which violated your privacy. Of course, the Daily Mail group argued that I didn't have privacy because I was a public figure, and therefore it was a matter of public policy and interest for them to know everything about me. It's an interesting point that when you get right on the top of a company, you've probably abrogated your privacy anyway, in today's terms. But I fought this and I kept it bottled up. I couldn't tell anyone about it, because if I told anyone what we were doing, it was contempt of court. So for 4 months, we were battling this case, which eventually I lost on May the 1st. I got permission to hire a top PR firm, which I did, to just maintain the storm. All they said to me was this: there's not a lot we could do, this is going to be terrible, you just need to toughen up your skin, and you need to, get used to it.
Yeah.
And
I like
one
the
of my
quote in your book was, when the caravans move.
That was another friend of mine,
yeah.
a great politician friend of mine, who'd been beaten up no end of times, used this quote from Joseph Needham, who's a great scientist, sinologist, who said, so to finish things off, the dogs bark and the caravan moves on, which is absolutely true. The dogs do bark and then the caravan moves on. So I left BP on May the 1st. It was May Day. I thought that was quite important. And I decided that so all the security people said, you really need to leave the building by the back entrance. There were all kinds of different escape entrances from BP headquarters, because there were quite a lot of protests from time to time about the oil industry. But I said, no, I think I'm going to walk through the front door, because I felt to myself that I had rights too. So I walked through the front door and I met the world's press, and they became my constant companions for 3 days. And people on motorbikes chasing me with long telephoto lenses. And after that, they left me alone. So I just decided I had to just redo my life. So I did.
Yeah, oh, great. So maybe one more question about the book. Are you happy with what it has achieved so far?
So the purpose of the book is to do what I said at the beginning. But in the end, it's not a book. I want to maintain momentum for great positive change that's taking place, that is probably not, I think, other than limited and very important parts of, but very limited areas, there's still a lot to do in the corporate sector to get people to feel comfortable to be themselves. And I say this by the number of people I've spoken to, much more of your age than mine, who have still chosen, for reasons of concern, to stay in the closet at work, but be out in private life. And so I think I just observed that this was going on, and I felt also that at the senior levels, I noticed how the progress of women in business always had promise and never quite achieved what it was expected to do. I can speak very clearly about the UK, where, for example, there's been a big push to put women on boards. So there's 20% women as non-executives on boards. That's nice to have. But the real question is, how many women on executive and management committees are there? And the answer is only 6% of management committees are women. So I said, if after all that effort, this is what we achieve with women, I think we've got to work very hard to achieve something with LGBT people. And so the purpose of the book's a movement, and I'm happy that that's beginning, I'd say. Okay. Sales of the book are fine, all that sort of stuff, but that's not the point, I'd say. The point is what the book talks about, not the book itself.
Yeah. And in your book you quote that 41% of LGBT executives in the USA decide to stay in the closet, and 34% in the UK. Yep. So the US a bit worse than the UK. So why do you think it's still the case? Because especially also in the US, in most states, you know, I think there's some, I'm not American, so I will say stupid things, but in most states you cannot be fired, you cannot, you know, what do you think is it?
I think there's a very long shadow, and I do think that, I say to people in London, you know, here we are, we're sitting in Chelsea and Mayfair in London, we sit in Shoreditch and Notting Hill, and everything looks fantastic. I said, do you want to travel 50 miles north out of London and ask the question again? It's very different. Yeah. I'd suggest the same here. You want to travel east from this place, 50, 100 miles? Well, it could be different. Yeah. You want to go to, I mean, I've worked all over the States. I worked in some really exciting places like Cleveland, Ohio. So, you know, and which I liked, actually. But you know, around Cleveland, it's going to be more difficult to be yourself than it is in New York City, yeah, or in Mountain View, or in San Francisco, yeah, or in Paris. It'll be much more difficult in Rome. Yeah. You know, so there's a lot of inconsistency, and it's very easy for all of us, I think, to think, right, we're done, because I look around my 100 yards around me and everyone's fine. But actually the world's much bigger. When you go outside the US and Europe, you really do see some big issues. Yeah. In 77 countries, still it's a criminal act to either promote or undertake homosexual acts. 5 of the countries it's a death penalty. And it's not actually getting better, it's getting worse. Yeah. And
maybe talking about that, a lot of us will have read that Economist, I think of 2 weeks ago, talked about kind of the extreme gay divide. And it talked about more or less people going from, you know, very tolerant, nice, to kind of extremely conservative. Russia, Middle East, and then you see, especially in the US, for example, gay marriage, yes, you know, really is taken off beyond belief. Yeah. Everybody could not have hoped for more. What can we do about this? You know, do you think, as you know, we work in Google, you know?
Well, you can't change. I mean, no corporation can get anyone to change the law, really. Yeah, certainly outside their home country, and then they can lobby, but it's usually for business purposes. Yeah. I believe there is a business purpose to get LGBT inclusion. It improves productivity, apart from being right on a values basis. But I think what you can do is you can apply an economic nudge, a big economic nudge, which I think's worked in my own direct experience in environmental matters, in transparency, you know, payments to governments, transparency, in certain other human rights. So CEOs can apply nudge to get change. And interestingly, the most important thing, I think, is to, when you have expatriate cadre of people, to send out gay people to a place like Uganda as the CEO of the local branch of Company X. As long as they don't break the law, it's an amazing signal, I believe, and it's a signal of equality, of a real inclusion, and I think a point being made which is not for that purpose alone, because it's about the company, but it makes the point a company has a variety of people doing great things at great merit, regardless of their background, regardless of their sexuality.
Yeah, great. So I think maybe it's time to go to Q&A. Medea has the microphone, so if you have a question, don't be shy.
My question is, if you have a point of view on how well Silicon Valley and the tech industry does in this space. I think the reputation is that tech is rather inclusive compared to other industries, but do you think we're all the way there, or is there more of a ways to go?
I don't have, I think, a knowledgeable analysis. What I do observe, though, is a lot of statements about the difficulties in some parts of Silicon Valley, including San Francisco, where some companies have become more frat house style companies, and this has been bad for all forms of inclusion, LGBT being no exception, women being no exception. So I think you have to be very careful about, like any organization, you've got to be very careful to maintain a clear-eyed view on inclusion, which means that people don't get put into a position of being excluded inadvertently, or inadvertently, actually, now discrimination is rare, but inadvertent exclusion by team activity that doesn't allow people to be themselves. And I think you have to be very careful about that, because enthusiasm can take you to a place which is negative as opposed to positive. So I see that as probably the biggest danger.
So then, just as a follow-up, so you think the remedy, at least on a micro level scale, is to just be mindful of how your team engages with one another, or what do you think?
Generally, I mean, I think the formula is a fairly straightforward formula about getting almost anything done in business. The leader has to say, I want it to happen. Secondly, managers have to spend time making it happen, which means they've got to be encouraged, directed, or incentivized to put time on their agenda, to talk to people and figure out how to include people. What to do to make it safe for LGBT people to be themselves. What to do to make sure that men can interact with women in a way which makes sense. So time, and then measuring that through surveys, and then making sure that you have the role models. We talked about that, so signals from the top, measurement, role models, and finally making sure that inclusion means inclusion. So it doesn't mean having LGBT networks and saying, well, we've got those, that's great, tick. Actually, it's about including straight allies and everybody in bigger networks. The danger is simply satisfying yourself that you've done something important by getting all the people who are just the same as each other, talking to each other, and keeping it sealed up. That's not right. That's not right.
First of all, just thank you for your candor. It's been a really wonderful talk so far.
Thank you.
I'm wondering, when you were still heading up BP, did you ever consider coming out? Or was that just never a possibility?
I never thought about it, because you have to remember, I mean, I'd been in the closet, I suppose, well, I was 59 when I was outed. So pick the date when I started, 13, let's say. So that was a grand total of 45 years. By that time, I really had persuaded myself that my arguments about not coming out were absolutely perfect. There was no question that they were wrong, because after 45 years of talking to yourself about a topic, you're bound to be right. I mean, who is to disagree with you? So I'm trivializing it, but these were firmly held beliefs, so it didn't even cross my mind. Strangely, like everybody, in a position that I held, when I go and talk about my book and what what I believe is right to get, you know, this movement moving right across the world, people say to me, well, John, you know, we knew you were gay. It's just that we felt that you didn't want to hear from us. And we kind of respected that. So everybody knew I was gay, apparently. I mean, even in other companies outside BP, you know, in the oil and gas sector, a guy got up I was presenting at a literary festival, Cheltenham Literary Festival, and he got up and said, well, you know, we all knew you were gay, but we just couldn't bring ourselves to say it to you. And we just felt it was very tragic that you didn't know that. But that happens. It happens a lot. It happens a lot. People guard themselves for safety. No one ever does something, I mean, really recklessly unsafe. And I thought that was recklessly unsafe to come out. If I can add, it would be very interesting, you know, why I think Tim Cook coming out is very important. Again, a lot of people said they knew he was gay, a lot of chatter, but there's a very big difference if you're a leader to actually come out and say, I'm gay, and then elaborate. And he, therefore, had there been someone like him around while I was CEO of BP, and maybe another CEO of a big company, I might have said, well, if he can do it, so can I. And it would have given me a lot of confidence. I might not have done it, but it would have given me much more confidence.
And maybe for me to chip in, why do you think it took him so long? Because I think it was well known in the Valley.
Coming out is a process which, unique process, and everyone has all kinds of barriers that they've got to, or demons they've got to kill, barriers they've got to overcome. And actually I've noticed that the one or two CEOs of smaller companies who are out before they become a CEO almost kind of go back into the closet for a little while they're a CEO, and then come out again. And it's because the change of status makes them feel that they need to express different priorities.
Yeah.
You know, so I think everyone does it that way. I mean, I think I'm very struck by a lot of people younger people who work with me. They always say, well, you know, who are gay, and they say, well, John, it's fine for you. You know, everyone knows you're gay now. We, on the other hand, every time I change a job, I have to come out, and it's exhausting. They say it's absolutely exhausting. So we need to figure out how to make coming out not important.
And sorry, I know there are more questions, but so what is the advice you would give? So how do you do that? You know, so what would you advise to somebody who is in the closet and is struggling to get out based on how you look at it?
So on my own experience, if I replay it all, I'd say first, don't invest too much time building two lives, because it is negative investment, and actually it's difficult to, literally like an investment, it's very difficult to write off, as it were. You've got to, the more you build the edifice, the more it's with you. So the sooner you can come out, the better, I think. Secondly, but don't do it recklessly. You've got to be with an employer who's made it safe for you to do that. So you've got the right signals, the right encouragement, the right networks, not just gay networks, but gay and straight networks. But you can't do it recklessly. No one can be expected to do it recklessly. But I think there are increasingly employers who can do that. And I go further and say, actually, if you find it intolerable, leave and find another employer that will let you do this. And I'm very struck that, you know, again, I've interviewed people who were very intrigued with what companies were saying about LGBT inclusion at these recruitment fairs. And many of them were straight women. And they said, we go around talking to the LGBT recruiters because we figured out that if they get this right, they probably get gender right. Sort of leading indicator, lagging indicator.
Yeah.
So the oil industry has a lot of aspects of it in the companies where there can be kind of an old boys culture, a very conservative, what advice would you give to someone struggling with the decision to come out in that industry, and also to someone who wants to be an ally working in that culture?
So I think one thing I did when I came out in a rather spectacular way, I was out in a spectacular way, was to change some mindsets somewhere. So my old company, BP, for example, is doing very well in this area. They're very concerned. They're very, very concerned about making sure that inclusion, LGBT inclusion, is deeply in the agenda, and they've done it very well. I mean, two members of the management committee are out gay people. The global head of HR and the global head of supply trading, which is the place where 90% of the revenue of BP is generated. Mm-hmm. So it's not exactly a small job. So this is great, and they all say, well, we went back and thought about what on earth was going on, and they did something about it. So I think more and more people are feeling comfortable to come out in that environment. They're very concerned about making sure that it's not a barrier to post people or to send people to Russia and there are plenty of places the oil industry works, which is, where a lot of other companies don't. West Africa, lots of places, the Middle East, and they're doing that. They're absolutely doing that. So I think there are one or two companies, and there are other companies. I mean, it's well known that I think on the HRC index, Exxon is the only company that for 3 years has had a negative score. So it's made of extremes. It's made of extremes. I think gone are the days when I joined the oil industry, there were hardly any women in the oil industry. There was an event, I remember, even in the United States where I worked. The event was having a woman engineer arrive and having to find a space to make a women's lavatory. But things have changed a lot. So I think that sort of how I managed to tolerate it, I'm not quite sure, but you just get used to things. But it's an overly exclusive, good old boys network that is, I think, in these big companies has changed. In small companies, I still think it's just like that in the oil industry.
And maybe related to that is that a little anecdote from Google. A very senior colleague of mine, female, is in Hollywood at the big studios. There's a big meeting. There's the big Hollywood film boss. There are guys, there are some women, and then he says to her, "Hey, honey, pour me some coffee." So imagine, so that if that happens, what do you do? So, because I don't think that blatant discrimination is the issue. It's always the kind of stuff that you say, do I now really, but you're in a kind of partner meeting, this is not within the company, so there is clearly some business to be done. How principled, how would you deal with that?
I think you need to be very principled because people observe you. You always observe behavior in the more difficult circumstances. It's easy to be perfect when there are no issues. It's tough to be even half perfect when there are big challenges. So people, it doesn't matter what it is, they always test you and they observe, they watch. So if you say to people, I really want to be an inclusive organization, and the first thing you do is go out and be exclusive, then people say, well, this is a joke. This is a joke. So you've got to be consistent. So I like the IBM approach, which is they say, look, people behave like that, we don't want them as suppliers or customers. Yeah. And I believe they're pretty close. And BP's the same. Yeah. Now, they have to go with their eyes open. You go to Abu Dhabi and Dubai or go to Qatar, and you know the rules you're undertaking, which is it's illegal there for people to undertake homosexual acts, period. Yeah. It's not illegal to be gay. It's different. And therefore you can behave correctly and appropriately, but you shouldn't take any discrimination or any pejorative words. I mean, you occasionally have to educate people. Yeah. I was very struck in my own private equity firm. I'm a partner of a private equity firm. We had this meeting of CEOs of some of our portfolio companies where they'd sold half their company, or we'd got out of some of our investment, and so they'd made quite a lot of money, these people, correctly. So there were a panel, and one of my partners was chairing a panel, said, what's it feel like when you go home and tell the wife that you've made all this money? So I look at the audience, I'm sitting there, and first of all, the number of limited partners, investors, represented by women, not that many in private equity, but there are some. And I noticed one or two of them wince a little bit, but they're kind of used to it in that sort of milieu, but inappropriate. So afterwards I went up to the guy and said, well, I want you to know that I'm not sure how my partner, who's a man, would think about this. And he said, I got it. He said, I'm so sorry. No one had ever told me about this. No one ever told me about it. And I think a lot of it is a little bit of education for people who are generally pretty smart, and they've generally got great common sense. And just a bit of education to say, don't be politically correct, just be commonsensical. Just use your common sense. And it goes a very long way, I think.
Research shows that companies that are led by diverse leadership perform better financially. But it's I'm going to skew it. It's kind of unclear whether it's because it's like an indicator of a good management team, or is it because the people are able to be themselves more and more productive. So this is kind of hypothetical, but have you thought about how it would have been if you were out at BP? And can you address what are the reasons that these companies perform better?
So there's a lot of work in this area. Some of it's a little suspect because the data analysis is not clear, but some of the really good work is this, that people have simply divided the 20 years worth of staff surveys, employee surveys. So they've gone around and divided companies into those which have high engagement scores against those who have low engagement scores. On these surveys, they're consistent data. And they compared the financial performance of these two data sets. Those with high performance engagement consistently outperformed those with low engagement by around about 2% a year over a 20-year period. It's fantastic, huge outperformance, huge outperformance. Now engagement, the most about engagement is about inclusion. And if you get inclusion right, then engagement follows. And it's pretty obvious really, that if you don't have people who are engaged, they're using their mind for something else, or in the reverse, they're using their mind to be someone they're not, and therefore they can't engage. So I think engagement produces a very significant, and therefore inclusion of all sorts, including LGBT, produce outsized financial returns. There's a second dimension, which is when you make a decision, you really do want people to come at a decision from different points of view. Otherwise, again, you're persuading yourself that you're absolutely perfect and you know all the answers. And therein lies real danger. And that's where corporations fail. So having diverse management teams at all levels is really very important. That diversity is generated many different ways, depending on the company you're involved in. If you're in a resource company, you want to make absolutely sure you've got you've understood how you can include, for example, a simple thing like people from the country in which you are working. That was a novel idea a long time ago. And if you're marketing something, then surely you want to understand the impact and the understanding of people from different race, backgrounds, different sexuality, you name it. So I think there's lots of different ways of creating diversity in decision making. But I come back saying, if you get LGBT inclusion right, chances are you've got all sorts of other inclusion right. because it's one of the more difficult things to consider, especially when it requires, you have to get inclusion right in order to get people to self-disclose that they're gay, in order to get inclusion right. So it's, if you think about it, it's a multi-stage process, whereas other things are like single-stage process. So I'm an engineer, so I need to stop.
Hi, I have 3 questions. First one being that if you knew then all the things that you know now, would you change your experience with resigning from BP? Would you have let everything played out as it did, or would there have been things that you would have changed?
So I think at the time it was very clear to me that I had to resign from BP because it was, the circumstances were unusual. I knew that the press would go after me, and I didn't want BP to suffer that. In particular, you know, I'd invested a lot of my life in this firm, and I just didn't want people to be damaged in that way. So it was very clear to me that this was my responsibility, and I had to get control of my life, and the way to control it is to take an action. And it was very clear that the action was to resign, not just from BP, but I tried to resign from everything I was involved in. Some people simply refused to accept it because I thought we'd just start again, really. You know, why not start again? And so I think the decision was right. Today, I think I'd have to think about it in the circumstances, and like, you know, Keynes, you know, my answers change as the information changes. So I think now it would depend on the circumstances, but I think it would be easier probably to say, well, I'll just fight it. I'll just carry on. I think, and every year goes by, I think it will get easier.
And since leaving BP, have you ever been brought back in as a consultant? And if so, have there been any advice that you've provided, like culture-wise, to the company?
No, I haven't been invited back up until recently. So first of all, I do not believe in fact, I hate the idea of former CEOs coming back into a company and saying, well, you know, in my day, or no, this is a much better way of doing things. Even worse, actually commenting on the outside. I don't approve of that either. Because, you know, the person in charge is the person in charge. And they say the king is dead, long live the king, you know, so it's gone. It's very ephemeral. And so I don't approve of that. So it took me 5 years to go into the building, back into the BP building, and I was invited in, not by my successor, because he was let go after the Gulf spill, but his successor, who also used to be my executive assistant when I was a CEO, and he said, come and have lunch on July the 4th. BP's open for business. So I went into the building on July the 4th and had lunch and met everybody. It was very nice. And then I didn't go back again until I was invited by BP to come and talk about the glass closet. And that I was invited in, for those of you with historical perspectives, on a Bastille Day. Seems a very appropriate moment, the start of the revolution. I thought it was just right. And so I was invited in and interviewed, amazingly, by a rather wonderful straight man who also used to be my executive assistant, now in charge of all the production operations at BP. So he interviewed me, and it was done because BP's like Google in lots of places. We did it in the media center and was transmitted all over the world. So that was rather good, and a lot of change. I don't think it would have been difficult to imagine inviting in any gay man, let alone the former CEO, to BP 8 years ago, to do such a thing.
Great. You have 3 questions?
Yeah, one last one.
Yeah, last one.
That's a little silly. You did mention earlier Cleveland, Ohio, in your experience working there. How did you feel about them hosting the gay games earlier this year?
Well, I was invited to them and I couldn't make it. And unfortunately, I used to work for the Standard Oil Company, Ohio, there. I was in the Standard Oil Company. And one of the people who used to work for me is actually the president of the gay games for the year. But I just couldn't make it. It was, the timing was all wrong. But I think it was terrific.
What advice would you give to a young person at a company that they felt like their career was being stifled in some way by being out? Would you say you should go to a company that's more open to that, let's say Google, or they should stay? Because an analogy could be drawn for like people in states like Alabama, for example. So should all the gay people in Alabama just move to San Francisco and New York?
Yes.
But in a way, Alabama is never going to make progress if gay people keep leaving. In the same way, corporations that are unfriendly to gay people are never going to make progress.
I think it depends on your future view, doesn't it? It depends on whether you can see any progress at all. But I mean, if it's going backwards, then I'd suggest walking out and doing something else, because if you really do believe nothing will change. But actually, a lot of places, you can see some elements of change. So if you think you can see it, and you can be part of it, then stick with it. I do think it's important that individuals try, in so far as possible, to control their own destiny. That there's nothing, well, there are plenty of bad things in life, but one bad thing is to feel that you're out of control of your own destiny. You know, someone is pushing you around or doing something that doesn't allow you to be yourself. But if you can see changing that, then stay. If you can't, go. But it's an interesting mind experiment to think of all the people from Alabama going to both coasts. It would be extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, so you could argue that it's relatively easy for us, working at Google, living in San Francisco or Shoreditch. At the same time, we have a great platform. We reach millions of people, billions of people. What can we do to help? What is your message for us?
Well, I think you can, because information and little things like role models. And one of the reasons I put together this founded this website, glasscloset.org. It's not huge, but it's designed to aggregate role model stories so that people can talk and see. So it's sort of getting this information out, getting people to talk to each other. These things are very important indeed. It's surprising. What is very surprising is who gets to read this stuff outside the UK and the USA. And the answer is a lot of places where it's illegal to do anything gay. People want to read it because they see in these stories an aspiration that they'd like to hold, that things could be different, and that actually they could be different themselves, and maybe they can make a change. So I think Google can participate in this hugely, hugely, because it does have the footprint of the world. And the world also includes places in the United States where it's tough, also places outside London and Manchester where it's tough, also places outside Paris and so forth. But also in places like Saudi Arabia and in Uganda. And now I see Singapore, where the Supreme Court has just reversed certain rulings to again make it illegal to undertake homosexual acts.
Well, I think we're wrapping up. Maybe 2 short questions with very short answers, which is, you've been now in 3 locations at Google. What did you like worst? What disappointed you? And it can be my T-shirt, so it doesn't... Yeah.
It's not the T-shirt and it's not the coffee either.
Okay.
And certainly not the food, I may say.
Yeah.
I think what's the worst? I think it's we met in internal rooms with the single exception of this.
Okay.
And I think this is a rather wonderful room to meet in. It sounds trivial, but it's very oppressive to meet in darkened rooms.
Yeah. And then the best thing, to end on a positive note,
you know, I think the best thing is every time I look at an audience on Google, people are very interested. And what is surprising, maybe there's a rule here, but I was warned in New York and London that multitasking was the name of the game, and that I should expect people to be listening to me but actually doing something else. I haven't seen that happen here.
Minimally, I think minimally.
I think it's rather wonderful, and I take it as an important thing. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.